I've been an auctioneer for more than 50 years, and it won't come as a surprise to you to know that one doesn't wake up and say, well, I think I'll be an auctioneer this lifetime. I was studying law and economics at Monash, not enjoying it very much. My girlfriend at the time wanted to go skiing. I didn't have any money, never enough money to go skiing, but I had my childhood stamp collection. And I decided I would see if I could sell the stamp collection to raise some money to go skiing. Typed up a little catalogue and printed it on an old Roman machine. And much to my surprise, after a little advertisement in a now defunct stamp magazine, I had sold $8,000 worth of stamps. 1972, I think. I found that I quite enjoyed the process. It was not a public auction, it was what was called a postal bid sale. I sold out of all the stamps and people started writing to me and saying, when is your next auction going to be? When I said, I haven't got any more stamps, I sold them all. But members of the Philatelic Society of Monash University said, we'll give you some stock, why don't you do it? You know, it was good. So to cut a long story short, within 2 years of that, I was turning over $1 million a year, just making commission. I don't want you to think I was making $1 million, but it was relatively easy in the early 70s to call yourself an auctioneer and start writing catalogues, even if you knew as little as I did at the time. But I was hooked, and I loved the process, and within a year of that, I started having public auctions. The public auctions were at the Melbourne Town Hall. 53 years later, I describe myself as an accidental auctioneer. It probably won't come as a surprise to you that I didn't finish my law degree or my economics degree, much to the chagrin of my late parents. But they were supportive. They saw that I was doing quite well, that I enjoyed what I did it passionately, and I'm still enjoying what I started doing 53 years ago, and I still do it passionately. And today I'm here because Eva discovered something in one of our catalogues where I didn't have her in mind, but I was trying to do the best I could in relation to the story that the object wanted to tell me. And that's what motivates me. If it's something that I can discover a story about, as was the case with this picture, and I can tell the story and people respond to it, that is a fantastic result. So just to put it in perspective, we have about 12 auctions a year. We produce a beautiful catalogue each time, about 12 to 1,500 items per auction. So if you think about that, that's about 15 to 20,000 items a year going through the auction house. We sell about 90 to 92% of the items that are consigned, and that means my ability to take on more is quite challenged, especially when you get something or a collection where everything needs time, needs some research, needs to get the perspective right, get the chronology right. Things arrive in a jumble very often. Death comes as a surprise to most people, unexpected event in their otherwise crowded schedule, and they leave their pet project, the project that has been occupying their adult mind for decades. It's unfinished. So I have to try and get into the mind of the collector. I have to try and complete the circle of the story. And I like to go into a home where the collector is still living. It's the best source of the story. But if the collector has passed away, I like to walk around the home and try and understand what was going on. What was the motivation in keeping an object or in keeping a piece of paper, a photograph, a document? Why is it here? And how does it relate to the other pieces? this is an interesting story. This painting came up at a Sydney auction, a weekly auction, where it was described as a soldier in military uniform, and the estimate was $120. And one of my clients rang me and said, there's a painting coming up in Sydney, I'm thinking of buying it, can I send it to you for auction? And I said, send me a photograph. So he sent me this photograph. And as you can see there, and as you can see here, it is signed Tatura, 1940, Slawa Duldig. Now, the auction house in Sydney didn't mention it. It wasn't photographed in a catalogue, it was photographed on their website. There was no printed catalogue, it was just a weekly, stick a number on a lot, say it's a painting, put $100 and it'll find its level. And they think they did the right thing because they got $650 for it. 6 times estimate. Who's going to complain? It was my client buying it, he sent it to me. Now, I had heard of Karl, but I hadn't heard of Slawa. I wanted to know who was Slawa. Was she related to Karl? What was she doing in Tatura? What was she doing in 1940 and how did she get there? Why was she there? And I spent quite a bit of time reading the fascinating story and researching the story that was familiar to me from other stories that I was aware of the De Niro boys and Gustav Nossel and Felix Werder and various other people who we know were caught up in this anti-German fifth column anxiety, but then stayed on in Australia and enriched the lives of Australia tremendously. So I wrote about that in the catalogue because a painting of a soldier in uniform, which is what they was described at in Sydney, was almost irrelevant. Who was the soldier? It was clearly George VI. I'm assuming some kid who wasn't told to do any research, just described it and nobody looked at it. But to do nothing about the information that was there and clearly available to launch a research project, I thought that was criminal. So I didn't have Eva in mind, this force of nature who entered my life. I had in mind telling the story that presented to me. Here is George VI. It was painted in Tatura, or appeared to be painted in Tatura, probably to put up in an assembly hall or the eating hall or something, because we all remember from state school that we stood on a Monday morning and we sang God Save the King or God Save the Queen, and we saluted the flag and we swore allegiance to the British Commonwealth. And I suspect that that's why it was painted. And the circumstances of the person who painted it were just fascinating to me. So I estimated it at $1,500. If we hadn't had any bids, I would have dropped it to $600, $700, $800 and I would have sold it, and the vendor would have got his money back, I suspected. Very often when I put a piece in auction and it has a Jewish element, there are members of the Jewish Historical Society, there are curators of the various museums in Melbourne and Sydney especially, there are occasional family members, there are people in the Jewish community who collect Australian Jewish ephemera, and there are also people who are interested in the story of those camps and the impact of the people who were often the cream of German and Austrian intelligentsia and creativity, who found themselves treated as enemies of the country that would ultimately welcome them. So that's an overwhelming story that I just have to tell. My job is not to write stories, it's to write an auction catalogue, but I just can't resist telling the story to the extent that I can in 200 words. It comes the day of the auction, and I think I had 1 or 2 bids around $700 or $800. Eva had introduced herself and had asked if she could come and bid, and of course the answer is yes. I didn't know whether you were there to bid on it or whether you were just interested or amused. And we had other people online and on the phone. And as you can see, Eva bought it. There was competition and it finished, I think, at $1,700 was the hammer price. And so when you add $1,800 plus commission, so it was about $2,200, $2,300, something like that. Which means the vendor was very happy, he backed his judgment. I didn't get rich, you don't get rich on a $2,000 sale, but I have the great, great joy of returning this priceless painting to the home where it belongs. And that's why I'm here today. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening. I hope you found that interesting.
As it happened, I was meeting my Corowa friends that day, and 3 of them are here today from my class of 54, would you believe it? And that day, in the morning, I got a message, a photo of this, and underneath was written my mother's name and Tatura in 1940, and I had never, 1940, I was 2 years old. I was in the internment camp, and I certainly don't remember my mother painting King George VI in the internment camp. I also have, as many of you know, many, many documents, and we'll come back to that. And so I would have thought that somehow or other, with such an important painting, as it turns out it is, that I would have had somewhere else a clue about this painting. But it wasn't there and it wasn't in my mind. And so I went away that day thinking, goodness me, I'm going to have to go over and have a look at it. And of course I did, and Charles caught you up on all that. But I had to think, now, how did this happen? And why did it happen? 85 years after it was painted, in a year which is very special to me because it's the 85th anniversary of my arrival in Australia. It's just so amazing. I'll take you back to Slawa, right at the beginning, my mum. Here she is in Vienna as a young woman, and she's already displaying considerable skill as an artist and is very gifted, and her parents support her to go to a school which was called the Vienna School for Art for Women and Girls. And there she studied art, and she was painting, as you could see, en plein air in the outdoors. But I would say this was her graduation piece, because she always herself very much had it hanging. It was the only example of her work which she had hanging in the house. And those of you who've been know it, and the others, I hope you see it today. It's a portrait of a lady who came to sit for the students at this college, and this would have been her masterpiece at the time, highly regarded by her peers and by her faculty. And here she is, just a bit later. She went to study at Kunstgewerbeschule, the School of Applied Art, and under a very famous sculptor called Anton Hanna. And there she meets my dad. I can't miss him. He's sitting front on the left with his long legs, and good-looking young man. And their teacher is the man with the beard and so on, and they're all having coffee in the sculptor's. He was a famous sculptor in Austria, and they're sitting in his studio having their morning tea. So, what does she do apart from art? She invents the foldable umbrella. This is sort of what she's famous for. Is there anybody here who didn't know that? Oh! Okay. That's sort of the thing that my mother, still, if you look up Slawa Horowitz-Duldig, that's the thing you're going to find out. So then she marries my dad, 1931, and there she is with her umbrella in Vienna in the good days. And they set up an apartment in Vienna, and my mother designs the furniture for the apartment, which those of you who haven't been here will see here. But the world changed for us. I was born in February 1938. In March 1938, Hitler invaded Austria, and he was welcomed by hundreds of thousands of swastika-wearing, saluting people in Vienna. Life became intolerable for Jewish people and for many others in the city. For a few months, my mum and my mum's sister Rella and me in the pram were still there. And that was the last photo taken in Vienna before we fled. We fled to Switzerland, and this man, I always liked to have this portrait up. My father, as the sculptor, would always use his art to help himself. And in this instance, he did a portrait of the immigration official, and I suppose he was head of immigration in the city in which my dad went to, in Zug in Switzerland, and his name was Ernst Speck. And the reason my father did the portrait was to thank him, because he enabled my mum and I to leave Vienna. And I won't go into the details, it's a convoluted story, but he gave my father the instructions to get my mother to send her passport to Switzerland, and then he would sign a return visa, and my mother would be able to leave Vienna with me and go to Switzerland. So that's the man who really, literally, saved my life in a way. So in Switzerland, we were only able to stay in Switzerland a really short time because they didn't want us, and we had to find somewhere else to go. And we ended up in Singapore, and that's the Malayan bungalow where we lived, and we had the top floor in that bungalow. And that's where my parents started their new artistic life. They kind of established themselves there. They had commissions. It was a very international community. There were diplomats, and there were lots of people who wanted a skilled European artist to do work for them. Why am I telling you this? Because when this portrait came, I had to think of a hypothesis. How, why, where did she paint it? Because, as I said to you, I don't remember her painting anything in Tatura. I'll go back to that in a minute. So up there on that top floor where we lived, my father had an exhibition, my mother worked, they set up an art school, and they were really living a wonderful life. Afterwards, if I said to my dad, what was the most exciting part of your life, or what did you find the most stimulating? He said Singapore. And we were only ever there for 15 months. So that's telling you something, really, I think. This is me and Mum. She's wearing a bandana. If you look over here, that's Dad's portrait bust of Mum at exactly the same time, also with her bandana. And it's it's really one of the best portraits that my father ever did, and he did a lot of portraits. She's very astute, and she's got to seek ways in which she can earn a living for the family alongside Dad. So aside from having the school for art, which they established and which people really came to, students, she also set about finding out, could she do some restoration work on paintings that were in the municipal collection in Singapore. So she had to establish her credibility. There's actually a lovely little photo which Melinda found in among negatives, which we really hardly ever looked at, because there are boxes of negatives and boxes of photos and boxes of photos. And there is Mum. It's not a terribly clear photo, but she is working on a portrait. Now, this one was also in among the box of negatives. And I hadn't seen this before till again, Melinda's looking for things all the time. We go finding new things all the time in this collection. And there is this portrait here. King George. And who was it today who told me it was the naval uniform? Somebody told me that. Melinda, yes, you did. In the naval uniform. Why did she do that? What made her do that? What was the incentive? She's establishing herself as giving herself credibility as an artist. She's demonstrating loyalty to the British Crown. After all, we were refugees, we were stateless, we were Jewish, and we had no place in this society. So to become kind of people who really were accepted in wherever you are, you have to try and establish some kind of loyalty to the people who you're living with and to the country in which you're in. And my mother, being the astute woman she was, saw this. So I can't tell you, I said, this is all hypothesizing, if that's a word. I can't tell you whether she did it because somebody asked her to or other things happened there. But it's there and it's demonstrating something to me, and it probably does to you as well. And there it is in that exhibition which my father mounted in Singapore at critical time. In the middle of 1940, war was on, war was declared. The exhibition was mounted, and it says in the newspaper, to raise funds for the war effort, for the British. So, interestingly enough, some of you who know the museum a little bit better will see there are two little busts there, and they are of me. The one on the left, you'll see them if you go into the heritage room and you look on the bookcase in the dining room, you'll see those two busts. And I just think it's quite amazing. There's the little bust of Eva and there's King George up behind. So the King and I isn't such a bad title after all. Charles, it's you who discovered this particular illustration. This is extraordinary. How did this painting come about? Charles wrote in his catalogue, and you've all got it on your seats, he's written King George in the uniform of Field Marshal, I think it is, and taken from the London Illustrated Journal, June 1940, photographed by a guy called Spatt, S-P-I-G-H-T-T. And I mean, it's just amazing that I should find this out now, but there's no doubt that this portrait, my mother painted the painting of King George VI directly from a small journal photograph she had somehow either been given or acquired. Now, she became very close to a group of people and did work for them in her restoration work. And these were the people in the municipality of Singapore, Victoria Hall, which was sort of the main, like Parliament building there. And the guy she was working with was a person called Ralph Bridges. And of course, my clues when I went back to it was go to the documents, go to the documents. And I've written the book, this book, based on all the documents, all the photos, everything else I could find. But I hadn't come across anything to do with King George till I began again to look at the documents. You saw a photo of my mother and Rella, her sister, and me in Vienna. My mother's sister was the only member of our family, of my mother's side, to survive the war. She remained in Paris. She was in Paris because she married a Frenchman who saved her life. And she was instrumental in keeping connections. They both wrote to each other copiously, as it ended up for 30 years. But this was one of the first letters that my mother received after leaving Europe, written in Paris on the 16th of June 1939. And in it, in German, and I have translated it, but basically, where I've highlighted, it says, the to do the portrait of the king would be very interesting. How wonderful that would be. Those are her words there, which I'm highlighting. That's the first clue. And I had seen that in researching my work earlier, and you'll find that actually I do quote that line in my book, but without actually finding out what actually happened, because I didn't know. Here she is in Singapore, and she sets about writing to Ralph Bridges at the municipality in Singapore, seeking work to restore the paintings in the municipal collection. And this is a closely typed 2-page letter in which he sets out her background. I'm an academic artist, and Melinda, my uncle or my relative was a portrait painter for Franz Joseph, the emperor. I mean, how she ever put that together, I don't know. But anyway, it was called Horowitz, so maybe that was a clue. And she gives herself a really high profile, and being British, the British are very, I would say, they respond. Their administration is perfection to a T, even in wartime in Singapore. She immediately gets a letter back. The letter says, we received your letter. There's later, would you come to meet me, Ralph Bridges, at a certain time, Singapore? Next letter, you're commissioned, because she went to meet Ralph Bridges and obviously made the right impression, and then he commissioned her to do a portrait of Sir Charles Mitchell, who was, when I looked him up just recently, because I had to look him up, he was the 14th governor of the Straits Settlements, and he was there just at the turn of the century. That's 1894 to 1907 or something like that. And he, obviously there was a portrait of him there that needed restoration, so my mother was going to be paid 400 Singapore dollars to restore Sir Charles Mitchell. Ralph Bridges signed underneath. Go to the documents. I knew this document. I had no problems with this document. My mother was working on all these things, and my father had the most amazing commissions and all of that. And that all came to an end too. But as it turns out, probably saved my life the second time. So here, we're given notice by the Singapore Straits Settlements Jewish Relief Committee, who were a group of Jews who were helping refugees like us at the time. But the notice was issued in July 1940, and it says in short time, you will all be deported. Not anything about where we're going, nothing like that. Just prepare yourselves, get organised, because you're going to be sent out of the country. Well, this was like, we're doing so well, it's just breaking up again. Where are we going? What are we going to do? Etc., etc. My mother in the middle of all these commissions, my father in the middle of other commissions, and me 2 years old. Here we are already on the way. In other words, my mother had gone back to Ralph Bridges and said, no, I can't, I can complete this portrait, but I can't do any more portraits. But I am going, will you write me a reference? So Ralph Bridges wrote this rather very nice reference for my mother, saying she completed some very satisfactory work and he could highly recommend her to work. And she brought that, as you can see, to Australia. At some point it must have been torn. Now, I must point out that the reason we have these documents is because my amazing mother kept them. And they were there for me to find when she died. She didn't tell me about them. She didn't say, oh, here are all these documents, I had to sort of, it was all there. I just had to find them. And it's been a jigsaw puzzle, and all my life, belatedly, 50 years of it anyway, has been sort of sorting through this jigsaw puzzle. which seems to get bigger and bigger, not smaller and smaller, but that's okay too. The hypothesis goes on, because I'll never have the correct answer to all this, but I can kind of imagine that she would have thought to herself, look, I can get this commission to go to paint King George for the Parliament House in Singapore, and they will pay me because I'm doing good work and so on, and I'll show my loyalty that way, and all of those things I've mentioned already. And the clue to that came actually quite strangely, and I just thought it was all ridiculous, but I was having lunch with my cousin, my late cousin, Arthur Duldig, who was 16 years older than me one day, and he said, oh, you know, Eva, your mum's portrait of the king was hung in Parliament House. And I looked at him and I thought, what's he talking about? You know, I didn't know anything about that. Well, maybe it was. I don't know. But she certainly, I think, although it's signed Charles Tatura 1940, I cannot for the life of me imagine that here, in this setup, when we arrived in September 1940 in Tatura, and this photo is taken in 1941, in 3 months of 1940 that were left, and being thrown into absolute disarray with sleeping on palliases in a tin shed, with another 250 other internees in an internment camp behind barbed wire. Here is us, the children, dancing around my father's sculpture that he created with an axe in that internment camp. But I can't for the life of me imagine my mother had the peace of mind or the wherewithal to start and finish King George VI in Tatura internment camp 3D. I think she brought it with her in an unfinished state, and she did have her painting material there. There are no other signs of any work by her done in the camp, but she maybe did manage to put the finishing touches to King George and sign her name clearly on the lower right-hand corner of that painting, and maybe even deliberately write down Tatura 1940, because that is what makes that painting so amazing. She was even asked in 1949, they wrote to her from Victoria Hall again, would you do some more restoration work? So she was not forgotten, even here in Australia 10 years later. The other question, the other major question, which I'm putting out to you, is please find out what happened to it in 85 years. Because Charles and I, and anyone else who's had a thinking about it, we have absolutely no idea. But what is so extraordinary for me is the condition of this painting. It is almost as if she's just painted it today. And if you go up to it, you will see those wonderful, just the brush strokes, so clear. It's so much better than a photo, and so much more. There's nothing like a portrait. A portrait has life. And she has given this King George the expression that she thought, how she thought about him. And when we look at it, we'll think about him in the eyes of Slawa Duldig. Thank you so much.